6 months after Margaret Whitmore's children sold her house and left her with 2 suitcases, they drove to the abandoned train station expecting to find proof that their mother had finally failed. They expected broken windows, weeds through the platform, raccoons in the ticket office, and a 74-year-old widow too proud to admit she could not survive alone. Instead, they found warm yellow lights shining behind restored glass, flower boxes nailed beneath the old station windows, smoke rising from a repaired chimney, and a hand-painted sign above the entrance that read, "The Last Stop House." People were lined up outside with casseroles, toolboxes, blankets, and grocery bags. An elderly man sat on a bench drinking coffee. A young mother folded donated coats near the baggage room. And standing at the center of it all was Margaret, wearing her late husband's faded railroad jacket, looking nothing like the helpless woman her children had described to the court. Her oldest son stepped onto the platform, furious. "Who gave you permission to do this?" he demanded. Margaret reached into her pocket and pulled out a small brass key, darkened with age, the same key her children had nearly thrown away when they emptied her house. "Your father did," she said. But the key was only the beginning. Because beneath that station, behind a locked electrical room no one had opened in 30 years, Margaret had found a secret her husband had protected, until the day he died, a secret that would prove her children had sold the wrong house, trusted the wrong lawyer, and forgotten the one woman who still knew how to read a railroad map. Before we go back to the day everything was taken from Margaret, remember this. Some stories are not about revenge. They are about dignity, about the quiet strength people overlook, and about the places that wait for someone brave enough to bring them back to life. If stories like that still matter to you, stay with Margaret until the final door opens. For most of her adult life, Margaret Whitmore had been known by the house before people remembered her name. In Bellwether, Ohio, folks did not say, "Margaret lives near the bend." They said, "You know the white house on Maple Ridge Lane, the one with the blue porch rail and the pear tree out back." That house had been hers for 46 years. It had held 3 babies, 2 weddings, 1 funeral reception, and more Sunday suppers than Margaret could count. Thomas Whitmore bought it in 1978, back when the roof leaked over the upstairs hallway and the furnace complained every winter like an old man with sore knees. He was 31 then, broad-shouldered from railway work, with coal dust caught in his hands. Margaret was 28, carrying their first child, and the kind of faith young wives often have before life teaches them what things truly cost. Thomas worked for the Bellwether Rail Line, first as a trackman, then as a maintenance supervisor at the old station on the east edge of town. He could read a rail map the way other men read a newspaper. He knew which bolts loosened after a hard freeze, which switches groaned before they failed, and which timbers only looked solid from a distance. Margaret learned beside him without anyone meaning to teach her. She brought him coffee on cold mornings, delivered lunches to the station office, copied supply numbers when the clerk was sick, and once helped label a wall of old schematics because Thomas said her handwriting was steadier than any man's on the crew. She did not call it skill then, she called it helping her husband. But over the years, helping became knowing. She knew the smell of wet iron. She knew the low hum of a working transformer and the angry buzz of one ready to burn out. She knew where Thomas kept spare keys, how he folded maps, and why he never trusted a document until he had checked the boundary lines himself. At home, Margaret raised Richard, Elaine, and Peter with the same quiet discipline. She stretched paychecks, patched jeans, made birthday cakes from scratch, and kept a small envelope of emergency money behind the flour tin. When Thomas came home exhausted, she rubbed liniment into his shoulders and listened as he talked about the station, the freight schedules, the slow death of passenger service, and the county officials who never seemed to understand that old places could still matter. The children grew up hearing trains at night. Richard used to run to the porch when the whistle sounded, waving as if the engineer could see him. Elaine collected smooth stones from beside the tracks and lined them along her bedroom windowsill. Peter, the youngest, followed Thomas through the garage with a wooden hammer, pretending to fix invisible rails. Margaret remembered Christmas garlands around the porch columns, Thomas lifting children onto his shoulders, the kitchen windows fogging while soup simmered on the stove. She remembered Richard breaking his wrist in the pear tree, Elaine crying because her prom dress was second-hand, and Peter coming home from community college 3 weekends in a row because he missed home more than he admitted. She had not been a perfect mother. No one who lives inside a real family ever is. She had been tired sometimes, sharp sometimes, too proud to ask for help and too busy giving it. But every corner of that house carried evidence of her labor. The scuffed pantry door, the quilt folded at the foot of the guest bed, the pencil marks on the laundry room wall where Thomas had measured the children every birthday. After Thomas died, the house became quieter, but not empty. His railroad jacket stayed on the hook near the back door. On winter evenings, Margaret sat at the kitchen table with his old brass key in her palm, not because she knew what it opened, but because its weight reminded her that Thomas had once trusted her with every important thing. 3 months before he passed, when his breathing had grown thin and the doctors had begun speaking softly in hallways, Thomas gripped her hand and said something that made no sense to her then. "If the tracks ever go quiet, Maggie, don't forget where the last sound came from." She thought grief had tangled his words. She kissed his forehead and told him to rest. Years later, when her children began lowering their voices in the next room, when papers appeared on her kitchen table before anyone explained them, when Richard started calling the house the asset instead of home, Margaret would hear that sentence again. And she would begin to understand that Thomas had not been wandering in his mind. He had been leaving her a direction. The first sign that Margaret's house was no longer being treated like a home came on a Tuesday afternoon, when Richard arrived with a leather folder under his arm and did not take off his coat. He had always removed his coat in that kitchen. That day, he stayed buttoned up, standing near the table, like a man visiting a client. Elaine came 10 minutes later with a casserole Margaret had not asked for. Peter arrived last, avoiding his mother's eyes. None of them brought spouses. None of them brought the grandchildren. None of them came hungry. They had come prepared. Richard placed the folder beside the sugar bowl. Elaine cleared away Margaret's crossword puzzle and reading glasses as if the table had to be made clean before the family could do something dirty on it. "Mom," Richard said, using the voice he saved for bank managers, "we need to talk about what's practical." Margaret dried her hands on a dish towel. She had been washing Thomas's old railroad mug. Practical usually means someone has already made up their mind. Elaine sighed. "No one is trying to take anything from you." Peter shifted near the back door. Margaret saw it. That small movement told her more than his words would have. Richard opened the folder. The papers had colored tabs along the sides, yellow for signatures, blue for initials, pink for places where some stranger had decided her life could be organized more efficiently. "You've had 2 falls this year," Richard said. "One on ice," Margaret replied, "and one because your son left his skateboard on my porch steps." "That isn't the point. It was my hip that hit the ground. I think I get some say in the point." Elaine touched Margaret's wrist. "Mom, we worry about you. The house is too much. The stairs, the furnace, the yard, the taxes. You forget things." "I forgot where I put the cinnamon once." "You left the stove on." "I left a burner warm under soup because Peter called and I went to answer the phone." Peter looked down. Richard's jaw tightened. "This is exactly what we mean. You always have an explanation, but explanations do not change risk." The word risk landed in the kitchen like something official. Margaret looked past him to the laundry room wall, where pencil marks still measured 3 children who had once believed she could fix anything. Now they were measuring her. "We spoke with someone at Rosebend Assisted Living," Elaine said. "It's clean, safe. They have music on Fridays." Margaret turned to Peter. "Did you speak too?" He opened his mouth, closed it, then said, "I think maybe it would be easier, Mom." "Easier for whom?" No one answered quickly enough. Richard slid the top paper forward. "We also had the property evaluated." For a moment, the kitchen changed shape around Margaret. "The property," she repeated. "The house," Richard corrected, but the first word had already told the truth. Margaret did not sit. "You evaluated my house?" "Our house, in a way," Elaine said softly. "It's the family home." Margaret looked at her daughter. Funny. It became the family home again when it was worth money. Elaine flinched. Richard did not. He had come ready for accusation, and that was how Margaret knew this meeting had been rehearsed without her. "The market is strong," Richard said. "If we sell now, the proceeds can go into an account for your care." "My care?" "Yes." "Who controls the account?" Richard glanced at Elaine. There it was. Small, quick, almost invisible. But Margaret had spent a lifetime reading the spaces between spoken things. "We would help manage it," Richard said. You would manage it. With oversight. Whose oversight? Mom, please, Elaine said. Don't make this adversarial. Margaret turned the papers around and saw a realtor's estimate, a preliminary listing agreement, and a document giving Richard limited authority to handle the sale if she became unable or unwilling to complete necessary steps. Unable or unwilling. They had placed those words together as if reluctance were an illness. When did you call the realtor? She asked. Elaine answered. Last month. Margaret nodded once. Before you asked me. We were gathering information. You were building a cage and measuring me for it. Peter whispered, Mom. She looked at him then. Her youngest child was 50 years old, with gray beginning at his temples, and fear still living in him like a boy who hated conflict. He seemed ashamed, but shame that did nothing was only decoration on betrayal. Richard pushed the pen closer. No one can force you to sign today, but if you refuse to cooperate, we may have to consider a competency review. Peter closed his eyes. Margaret felt something inside her become very still. Outside, a branch from the pear tree scratched lightly against the kitchen window. Thomas had planted that tree, the spring, after Elaine was born. You would take me to court, Margaret said. Richard softened his face. We would protect you. No. You would protect yourselves from the inconvenience of me disagreeing. Elaine's eyes filled. Mom, you think we're villains. We're not. We have jobs, families, bills. You don't see how much pressure this puts on us. Margaret folded the dish towel and laid it beside the sink. Her hands did not shake yet. I see more than you think. By Saturday morning, the sign was in the yard. Margaret saw it through the front window just after sunrise. For sale. Beneath it hung a smaller strip that said coming soon, as if her life were a product not yet fully released. Inside, Elaine stood in the dining room with packing tape. Boxes leaned against the wall. Some were labeled Donate, some were labeled Storage. One had Thomas's name written across it in black marker. Margaret walked to that box. His railroad jacket lay inside, folded badly beneath old manuals, and a framed photograph of him standing beside the Bellwether station sign. This is not storage, Margaret said. Mom, we can't keep everything. From the kitchen, Richard called, Elaine, where are the deed copies? The word deed moved through Margaret like a match being struck. She lifted Thomas's jacket and slid one hand into the pocket. At first, she felt only lint and an old receipt. Then her fingers closed around metal. The brass key came out cold against her palm, dark with age, stamped with 3 letters she had not noticed in years. B.V.S. Bellwether Station. For the first time all week, Margaret did not feel smaller. She closed her fingers around the key before Elaine turned back. That afternoon, while her children argued over appraisals, donations, and whether the dining table should go to Richard or be sold for staging, Margaret packed 2 suitcases herself. In one, she placed clothing, medicine, Thomas's photograph, the brass key, and the small envelope of emergency money she had kept behind the flour tin. In the other, she placed old rail maps, 3 notebooks, and the chipped railroad mug. At dusk, Rosebend Assisted Living called to confirm her arrival for Monday morning. Margaret thanked the woman and wrote down the address. Then she hung up, put on Thomas's jacket, and stood in the kitchen one last time. The house no longer felt empty. It felt occupied by decisions other people had made. Before leaving, she touched the pencil marks on the laundry room wall. Richard, Elaine, Peter, names, dates, heights, proof that children could grow tall and still fail to become kind. She locked the back door behind her. Not because she expected to return. Because Thomas had taught her never to leave a place unsecured, even after everyone else had stopped respecting it. Margaret did not call a taxi from the house. She walked 3 blocks with 2 suitcases before she reached the bus stop near the pharmacy. Cars passed with their headlights on, and every time one slowed, Margaret kept her face forward. She was not running away, she told herself. She was refusing to be delivered. By the time the county bus came, her wrists ached from the weight of the suitcases. The driver glanced at her luggage, but asked no questions. She paid with exact change, took a seat near the middle, and watched Maple Ridge Lane disappear behind the dark glass. At Rosebend Assisted Living, someone was expecting her on Monday. At her children's homes, someone would eventually notice she was gone. But for that 1 hour on the bus, Margaret belonged to no schedule but her own. She got off near the old highway, where the Maple Lantern Motel still rented rooms by the week to people who did not want to explain themselves. The clerk gave her a room at the back where the heater rattled and the curtains smelled faintly of dust. Margaret locked the door, pushed the chair beneath the knob, and sat on the edge of the bed. For the first time since Richard had placed that folder on her kitchen table, there was no one in the room telling her what was reasonable. She took out Thomas's photograph and set it on the nightstand. Then she laid the brass key beside it. Under the weak motel lamp, the letters stamped into the metal seemed clearer. B.V.S. Bellwether Station. At dawn, Margaret woke to the sound of a train horn so distant she wondered if she had dreamed it. Passenger trains no longer stopped in Bellwether, but freight still moved beyond the east fields. If the tracks ever go quiet, Maggie, don't forget where the last sound came from. After washing her face, Margaret went to the lobby for coffee. Near the vending machine stood a rack of free papers, coupon books, church bulletins, and county notices. She reached for the local weekly because Thomas had always read public notices. He said important things hid where impatient people never looked. Halfway down page 6, Margaret saw 3 words that made her fingers stop. Surplus property auction. Below it was a list of county-owned parcels scheduled for disposal. A drainage lot, a storage shed, a strip of land near the old quarry. Then she saw it. Bellwether Station, East Platform and adjoining structure. Minimum bid, $9. The old station had been closed for nearly 22 years. The county had argued about demolishing it, fencing it, selling it, ignoring it. It had broken windows, bad wiring, a collapsed section of platform, and enough liability warnings to scare any sensible buyer away. $9. Less than the packing tape Elaine had bought to box up Margaret's marriage. Less than the fee Richard would pay to have her signature notarized. The auction was that morning. Back in her room, Margaret opened one of Thomas's old rail maps across the bed. Track lines, service roads, utility access, boundary marks. A narrow spur line curved behind the station and vanished into a shaded block marked maintenance easement. Thomas had circled that word years ago in blue pencil. Easement. By 9:30, Margaret was standing inside the county administration building with the folded notice in her hand. The auction was held in a side room that smelled of carpet glue and stale coffee. Only 4 people sat in the 11 chairs. 2 men in work boots laughed over a phone screen. A woman from a property company whispered to someone wearing a county badge. The auctioneer looked surprised when Margaret signed in. "You understand the station is sold as is," he said. "I can read. I only mean there are structural concerns. Most old things have structural concerns. That doesn't mean they're finished." When Bellwether Station came up, the auctioneer cleared his throat as if even announcing it embarrassed him. Minimum bid, $9. Buyer assumes responsibility for code compliance, safety barriers, back taxes if applicable, and environmental review if required. One of the men in the back chuckled. "You'd have to pay me to take that dump." "Do I have an opening bid?" the auctioneer asked. No one moved. Margaret raised her card. The room went still in the particular way people go still when they are trying not to laugh too loudly. $9, the auctioneer said. "Do I hear 10? The property woman turned around. "Ma'am, do you know which building that is?" "Yes. It's condemned." "Not yet," said a county clerk at the side table. "Declared unsafe for occupancy, not formally condemned." His nameplate read Samuel Ortiz. The auctioneer sighed. "Do I hear 10? No one answered. The gavel came down with a small, almost apologetic tap. Sold for $9. For a moment, Margaret did not move. She had expected someone to stop her, correct her, tell her she had misunderstood. But no one did. The impossible thing had become official because she had raised her hand when everyone else kept theirs down. At the payment table, Samuel Ortiz reviewed the forms. When he saw her name, his pen paused. "Whitmore," he said. "Any relation to Thomas Whitmore?" "My husband." Samuel's expression changed. "My father worked county records before me. He used to mention Mr. Whitmore. Said he was the only rail man who ever came in with his own maps and better notes than the county." Margaret's fingers tightened around her purse strap. "Did my husband file something here?" Samuel lowered his voice. "I don't know. Some older rail files were never digitized, but now that you own the station, You may have standing to request related property records. Standing. The word felt different from ownership. Stronger. As if someone had admitted she was still allowed to rise. That afternoon, Margaret rode the county bus east until the driver told her it was the last stop. From there, she walked half a mile, along a service road lined with weeds, her suitcases dragging through gravel. Bellwether Station appeared slowly beyond a stand of bare trees. The roof sagged. The windows were broken. Vines climbed the brick like time trying to pull the building back into the earth. The platform edge had cracked, and the old sign hung crooked from rusted brackets. But Margaret did not see a dump. She saw Thomas at 35, waving from the office door with a clipboard in his hand. She saw coffee steaming in paper cups, wet boots on the floor, maps spread beneath yellow light. She saw a place abandoned by people who did not know how to measure worth unless it came with a clean appraisal. She set down both suitcases and took out the brass key. The front door did not open with it. Neither did the station office. Margaret almost laughed, because grief had taught her the cruelty of expecting answers to arrive in the right order. She put the key back into her pocket, gripped her suitcase, and stepped through a side door hanging loose on one hinge. Inside, the air smelled of dust, rust, and old rain. Broken glass glittered across the floor. Margaret stood beneath the dim afternoon light and listened. For a building everyone called dead, Bellwether Station made many small sounds. Wind under the doors, metal ticking in the cold, loose paper shifting somewhere in the dark. Not silence. Not yet. Margaret's first mistake was believing the station would feel smaller from the inside. From the road, Bellwether Station looked like a tired brick building with broken teeth for windows and weeds where travelers once stood. But inside, it expanded around her. Ticket office, waiting room, baggage area, corridor, stairwell, storage closets, and dark doorways that seemed to hold their breath. A piece of loose metal tapped somewhere near the platform. Rainwater dripped from a crack in the ceiling into a trash can left there years ago. A bird fluttered in the rafters, offended by her arrival. "All right," Margaret said aloud. Her voice sounded thin, but it belonged to her. "One room first." That was how Thomas had handled every impossible repair. One rail tie, one switch, one bolt. Never the whole line at once. She chose the old ticket office because it had a door that still closed, 2 narrow windows, and a counter sturdy enough to lean against. The floor was dirty, but mostly dry. A calendar from 1999 still hung near the cabinet, its pages curled like dried leaves. Margaret opened her suitcase and took inventory with the discipline of a woman who had once fed 5 people from a pantry others called empty. 2 sweaters, medicine, a flashlight, crackers, peanut butter, a thermos, half a roll of duct tape, a sewing kit, Thomas's photograph, the railroad mug, the brass key, $187 in cash. Not much, but not nothing. She dragged the bench against the ticket office door to block the worst of the draft. Then she taped cardboard from an old notice board over the broken lower pane of glass. It did not make the room warm, but it changed the air enough that she could remove her gloves for a few minutes. Outside, evening folded over the tracks. Margaret ate crackers with peanut butter from the tip of a plastic knife. She drank water from her thermos, saving half. The bathroom faucets gave only a coughing sound and a thread of brown water before quitting. The electrical switches did nothing. Her phone had 1% battery and no working outlet. For the first time that day, fear stepped close enough for her to feel its breath. Not the fear her children had described, the kind they used as evidence. This was cleaner than that. Practical. The night would be cold, the building unsafe, and pride would not keep her alive. Margaret accepted the warning without surrendering to it. She put on Thomas's railroad jacket over both sweaters and wrapped a scarf around her hair. Then she walked through the station again, slower this time, making notes in one of her old notebooks. Main roof leak near east beam. Platform door loose. Ticket office dry enough. Animal droppings near baggage room. South window broken. Possible access to basement or utility area near stairs. She paused at the stairwell. The steps led down into a narrow lower passage she did not remember from years ago. A sign on the wall had faded almost white, but when she wiped dust away with her sleeve, the old letters appeared. Authorized rail personnel only. Beneath that, another line had been scratched into the paint by hand. BWS Auxiliary Electrical. Margaret's pulse moved hard in her throat. She took out the brass key and held it near the sign, the same 3 letters, BWS. The passage smelled damp and metallic. She descended carefully, keeping one hand on the wall. Halfway down, her flashlight caught the edge of a heavy steel door set beneath the stairs. It was narrower than an ordinary room door, painted gray once, now mottled with rust. A brass lock hung from a hasp thick with grime. On the lock face, barely visible beneath corrosion, were the letters BWS. Margaret tried the key. It entered only halfway. She worked it gently. Nothing. She pulled it out, wiped the teeth on her sleeve, tried again. The key slid a little farther, then stopped with a stubborn scrape. "Come on, Tom," she whispered. "Don't make this dramatic." But Thomas, wherever he was, did not answer through metal. The lock would not turn. Margaret did not force it. Thomas had taught her that forcing old hardware usually broke the one piece you could not replace. She backed away, marking the door in her notebook. Locked auxiliary electrical room. Key may fit. Lock seized. On the way back up, her knee complained sharply. She gripped the rail and waited until the pain loosened. No one was there to see it. That was both mercy and loneliness. By full dark, the temperature had dropped. Wind came through the broken windows in steady currents. Margaret found a stack of old timetables in a cabinet and used them to stuff gaps along the ticket office window frame. She pulled down 2 dusty curtains from the waiting room, shook them outside, and folded one beneath her as a mattress pad. The other she spread across her legs. It was not comfort. It was survival arranged neatly enough to become bearable. Near midnight, something knocked against the platform door. Margaret woke, with her hand already closing around the flashlight. The sound came again, a slow wooden thud. For a terrifying second, she imagined Richard in the doorway, satisfied, carrying a doctor's letter and a court order. The third knock came with a scrape. She pushed the bench aside just enough to open the ticket office door. The waiting room was black except for the beam of her flashlight. Dust floated through it like pale insects. She crossed the room carefully, avoiding broken glass. At the platform door, the loose metal sign outside swung in the wind, striking the wood. Bellwether Station. The name appeared and vanished with each movement of the flashlight. Margaret exhaled, then found herself laughing once, quietly and without joy. Not because it was funny, but because fear had spent too much effort dressing wind as an enemy. She wedged a piece of broken chair under the sign bracket to stop the banging. As she turned back, her flashlight swept across the waiting room wall and caught something she had missed before. A row of old photographs hung above the bench, their glass cloudy with grime. Most were group pictures, rail crews, county officials, station workers. In one, a younger Thomas stood near the edge, one hand resting on a rolled map. Beside him was a man Margaret did not recognize, wearing a suit and holding a document tube. Under the photograph, someone had written in faded ink, "Final transfer review, 1,986. Margaret lifted the frame from the wall. The backing had loosened with age. Behind the photograph was a folded slip of paper, no bigger than a receipt. She unfolded it beneath the flashlight. Not a letter, not a map. Only 3 words in Thomas's blocky handwriting. "Check lower room." Margaret looked toward the stairwell. The building suddenly felt less abandoned than guarded. She carried the photograph back to the ticket office and placed it beside Thomas's picture from home. 2 versions of him now watched over her, the husband she had buried, and the railway man who had stood in this station holding secrets she had not been ready to inherit. Near dawn, Margaret slept for less than an hour. When she woke, pale light had entered through the broken windows. Her back hurt, her fingers were stiff, her mouth tasted of dust. But she was still there. The station had not defeated her in one night. She stood, folded the curtain, and wrote a list for the day. Water, heat, lock oil, gloves, plywood. Ask hardware store about old brass lock. Find county records request form. Do not tell Richard where I am. She underlined the last sentence twice. Then she opened the platform door. Morning spread across the tracks in a thin silver line, weeds bent under frost. Somewhere beyond the fields, a freight horn sounded, low and distant. Margaret touched the brass key in her pocket. The tracks had not gone quiet, and neither had she. At 7:30 that morning, Margaret walked 2 miles to Brooks Hardware with a notebook in her coat pocket and $9 less in her purse than she had owned the day before. By the time she reached Main Street, her knees ached, her hands were numb, and her pride had begun arguing with common sense. She could not repair a train station with a flashlight, duct tape, and courage. Courage was useful, but it did not seal windows or loosen seized brass locks. Brooks Hardware stood between the barber shop and the old pharmacy, its front windows crowded with snow shovels, paint cans, and a hand-lettered sign that said, "Please cut while you wait." The bell over the door rang when Margaret entered. A man behind the counter looked up from a receipt pad. He was in his late 60s, broad in the shoulders, with silver hair, a red flannel shirt, and the wary expression of someone who had seen too many people ask for credit they could not repay. "Morning," he said. "Help you find something?" "Lock oil," Margaret said. "Not spray lubricant. Something for old brass. Also work gloves, a pry bar small enough for interior trim, 2 hasps, exterior screws, heavy plastic, and whatever you recommend for covering broken windows until I can afford plywood." The man blinked once. Most people, Margaret knew, expected old women to ask where the light bulbs were. "That's a specific list. I have specific problems. What are you working on?" "Bellwether Station." The store seemed to grow quieter around the name. "You're the one who bought it," he said. "I am. For $9. That was the price. That place is unsafe. So is being put somewhere you don't belong." He studied her then, not rudely, but carefully. "Calvin Brooks. My father used to run this store before me." "Margaret Whitmore." At her last name, his eyebrows lifted. "Thomas Whitmore's wife?" "Yes." Calvin's posture changed, just a little. Respect did not arrive all at once, but something in him stopped dismissing her. "Your husband knew more about that station than anyone in this county. So, I'm beginning to learn." Margaret placed the brass key on the counter, along with the note she had found behind the photograph. Calvin leaned closer to read Thomas's handwriting. "Check lower room." "That his writing?" "Yes. You get in. The key fits partway. Lock won't turn." Calvin opened a drawer and pulled out a small bottle with a needle tip. "Use this. Don't flood it. 1 drop at a time. Let it sit. Tap the lock body with wood, not metal. If you snap that key, you may never get another." That's what Thomas would have said. Then he was right. For the next 10 minutes, Margaret and Calvin moved through the aisles as if preparing not for a repair project, but for a campaign. He showed her the cheapest plastic sheeting that would still hold against wind. She chose screws by thread, not by price tag. When he handed her a flimsy latch, she shook her head and picked a heavier one. "That door faces west weather," she said. "A cheap latch will rattle loose by the second storm." Calvin looked at her over the shelf. "You've done this before." I listened well. "No," he said. "Listening is when somebody talks and you nod." You remembered. At checkout, the total came to more than she wanted. Calvin took 2 items back and replaced them with used pieces from a bin behind the counter. "Salvage," he said. "Still good. I can pay what I owe." "I believe you. That's not why I'm doing it." He tore a receipt copy in half and wrote a number on it. "Call the store when you're ready for plywood. I deliver after closing." "Mr. Brooks." "Calvin. I'm not a charity case." "I didn't say you were. I said I have a truck." Back at the station, daylight revealed more damage but less terror. Night had made every shadow seem like a verdict. Morning made the building into a list. Margaret began with the ticket office. She swept glass into an old dustpan, wiped the counter with water she had bought in a gallon jug, and stretched plastic across the worst window. The first sheet sagged. She took it down, cut it smaller, and secured it with strips of wood from a broken signboard. By noon, the room held its warmth for almost 20 minutes after sunlight left the glass. That was not comfort yet, but it was progress with edges. Next, she examined the old fuse panel in the service closet. Most breakers were rusted or unlabeled, and the main feed had been disconnected long ago. Still, the layout told a story. One line led toward the waiting room, one toward exterior platform lights. Another descended beneath the stairwell. Auxiliary. Margaret copied every marking into her notebook. Thomas's old habit returned to her hands. Draw first, touch second, guess last. In a bottom drawer of the station office, she found a roll of brittle tracing paper and 3 curled maintenance diagrams. 2 showed ordinary plumbing and platform wiring. The third made her sit back on her heels. It showed a narrow utility corridor running beyond the lower electrical room and curving under the old baggage area. At the corridor's end was a rectangle marked with initials instead of a room name, T.V. Thomas Whitmore. The county auction sheet had mentioned the station building and east platform. It had not mentioned a utility corridor. It had not mentioned a lower room marked with her husband's initials. And it certainly had not mentioned anything extending beneath the baggage area. She opened Thomas's folded rail map beside the station diagram. The county lines did not match. On the county map she had received, the property ended cleanly at the rear wall. On Thomas's older rail map, a shaded strip continued past that wall toward the abandoned spur. Maintenance easement. A legal word, not an emotional one. Yet sitting there on the dusty floor, Margaret felt it like a pulse. Near 3 o'clock, tires crunched outside. A dark green pickup stopped near the platform. Calvin stepped out, carrying 2 sheets of used plywood and a paper bag. "I thought you said after closing," Margaret called. "I closed for lunch." "It's 3. Long lunch." He climbed the platform steps and paused when he saw the plastic over the ticket office window, the swept floor, the labeled notes taped to doors, and the station diagram spread across the counter. "Well," he said quietly, "I'll be." Margaret braced herself for surprise that sounded like insult. But Calvin only nodded toward the window. "That'll hold tonight if the wind doesn't turn mean." He helped her board the lower panes on the west side, saying little unless she asked. When she did ask, he answered plainly, without calling her sweetheart, without taking tools from her hands, without performing kindness as though she should applaud. That mattered more than he could know. As they worked, Margaret showed him the diagram. Calvin wiped dust from his glasses. "My father used to say there was a part of this place not on the county map." Margaret went still. "What part?" He didn't know. Just said the railroad kept certain rights after the county took over. Access, utilities, old land agreements. Calvin tapped the shaded strip on Thomas's map. "That looks like more than a service note." Margaret looked toward the stairwell. "Thomas filed something," she said. "Maybe." "No," she said, her voice firmer now. "He filed something, hid something, and left me the key." Calvin did not argue. At sunset, after he drove away, Margaret returned to the lower door with the lock oil. 1 drop, wait, a 2nd drop, wait, 3 light taps with the wooden handle of the screwdriver. She tried the key. This time, it slid all the way in. The lock resisted, held, then gave a tiny internal click. Margaret froze. She did not open it yet. Behind that door lay whatever Thomas had guarded, and for the first time since losing her home, Margaret understood that she was not simply surviving in a ruin. She was standing at the edge of a truth. Margaret did not open the lower room that evening. Her hand rested on the brass key, still turned inside the lock, while the station settled around her with the slow creaks of an old body. Every part of her wanted to pull the door wide and see what Thomas had left. But the flashlight was weak, the stairwell was cold, and the sensible part of her knew that secrets found in bad light could become accidents. So she turned the key back, removed it carefully, and whispered, "Tomorrow, Tom." The next morning brought rain. Not a storm, not yet, but a steady gray rain that softened the dirt road and made the broken gutters spill water in crooked lines down the brick. Margaret placed buckets under leaks, moved her bedding away from the damp wall, and spent 2 hours cleaning the old baggage room because it had the highest ceiling, the least broken glass, and a door wide enough for furniture if she ever found any. By noon, she had uncovered a wooden bench, 3 metal shelves, and a stack of canvas mail sacks, stiff with age. She shook out the sacks, folded them, and set them aside. They smelled of dust and old paper, but they were better than nothing. Around 4 o'clock, as the rain thickened, a car rolled slowly past the station. Margaret watched from the ticket office window. It was an old beige sedan with a dented rear door and fogged windows. It reached the end of the service road, stopped, then backed up. For a moment, Margaret thought it might be Richard. Instead, the driver's door opened, and an elderly woman stepped out wearing a brown coat too thin for the weather and plastic bags over her shoes. She stood in the rain, looking at the station as if trying to decide whether it was worse outside or inside. Margaret opened the platform door. "Can I help you?" The woman startled. She was small, but square-shouldered, with white hair pinned under a knit cap and a face that looked as though it had learned not to expect gentleness. "I'm sorry," the woman called. "I thought this place was empty." It was. The woman glanced at the warm glow of Margaret's battery lantern in the ticket office. "I'll move along." "Were you looking for shelter?" "No." The answer came too quickly. Margaret stepped onto the platform, feeling rain strike her sleeves. "Then were you looking for trouble?" "Because I can promise you, this building has enough of that already." The woman blinked. Then, despite herself, she gave a tired laugh. "My name is Lillian Price," she said, "and I was only going to park near the trees until morning. In this rain. I've slept in worse." That sentence told Margaret enough. She looked toward the sedan and saw blankets piled in the back seat, a plastic laundry basket, a small cooler, and a cane tucked beside the passenger door. "Not travel, displacement. Come inside, Lillian. I don't want charity." "Good. I don't have much to give." That seemed to satisfy something in Lillian. She locked her car, lifted a paper grocery bag from the front seat, and followed Margaret inside. In the ticket office, Margaret poured hot water from a thermos over 2 tea bags she had used once already that morning. The tea was weak, but it was warm. Lillian accepted the mug with both hands. For several minutes, neither woman asked the other to explain herself. That was a mercy. Finally, Lillian said, "My son sold my trailer." Margaret looked up. "Said it was too old, said the park was raising fees, said he had found me a better arrangement." Lillian's mouth tightened. "The better arrangement turned out to be his spare room, until his wife decided my oxygen machine was too noisy and my pension check ought to cover groceries for 6 people. Margaret felt the words settle into familiar places. "Did you leave?" she asked. "I was helped out," Lillian said, "with my things in trash bags." The rain tapped harder against the boarded window. Margaret looked at the old baggage room she had cleaned that morning. She had thought of it as storage. Suddenly, it looked like a room waiting for a bed. "You can stay tonight," she said. Lillian shook her head. "I won't be a burden." "Then don't be. Tomorrow you can help me sort those shelves." Lillian studied her. "You always this bossy?" "Only when people are freezing in my doorway." That night, the station held 2 women instead of 1. Margaret gave Lillian the baggage room with the driest wall and a curtain hung across the doorway for privacy. Lillian contributed a dented saucepan, 3 cans of soup, and a deck of cards with 2 queens missing. They warmed the soup on a small camping stove Calvin had loaned Margaret, sitting at the ticket counter, because there was no table yet. Lillian noticed the maps before she noticed the leaks. "You studying rail property?" she asked. Margaret's spoon stopped halfway to her mouth. "You know something about that?" "I worked county land records for 19 years before they replaced half of us with computers and called it progress." Margaret pulled Thomas's map closer. Lillian dried her hands on a towel and leaned over it. For the first time since Margaret had found the word easement, someone else saw what she saw. "This strip here," Lillian said, tapping the shaded line. "That's old railroad language. Access rights, utility rights, sometimes charitable use clauses if land was donated or transferred under condition." "Charitable use?" "Depends on the deed. Some stations were built on land families gave the railroad because they wanted service to reach the town. When those lines closed, the land didn't always transfer cleanly. People forget that paper has a longer memory than families." Margaret sat back slowly. "Paper has a longer memory than families." The next morning, Calvin arrived with a folding table, 2 mismatched chairs, and a box of canned goods he claimed had been taking up space at the store. He paused when Lillian stepped out of the baggage room, carrying a broom. "You collect people now?" he asked Margaret. "Only useful ones." Lillian lifted the broom. "I come with references." By afternoon, the station smelled faintly of soup, damp wool, and sawdust. Not pleasant exactly, but no longer dead. Margaret and Lillian cleaned the waiting room benches. Calvin fixed the platform door so it closed without groaning. Someone from the barber shop dropped off an old coffee urn after Calvin mentioned the station had a situation. By evening, Margaret had 3 more blankets than she owned that morning. The change was so small no newspaper would have noticed. But Margaret noticed. A room became different when more than one person expected morning to arrive there. 2 days later, a young woman appeared at the platform with a little boy asleep against her shoulder. She was no more than 30, with wet hair stuck to her cheeks and a backpack hanging from one arm. The boy wore dinosaur pajamas under a coat too large for him. "I'm sorry," she said before Margaret could speak. "Mr. Brooks said only maybe you might know where I could go for one night." Margaret saw the bruise half hidden beneath the young woman's collar and did not ask the question that would make her lie. "What's your name?" "Grace. Grace Miller. This is Noah." The boy stirred but did not wake. Behind Margaret, Lillian stepped forward, already reaching for the backpack. "Baggage room's taken, but the waiting room bench is better than a car." Grace's eyes filled so quickly, she turned her face away. "I can pay something next week." Margaret looked at Noah's small hand curled against his mother's coat. "You can help fold blankets tomorrow." Grace nodded, unable to speak. That night, Bellwether Station held 4 people. Margaret sat awake after the others slept, listening to the rain ease and the old building breathe around them. Lillian snored softly behind her curtain. Grace lay on the waiting room bench, with Noah tucked against her side, one arm wrapped around him as if the world might still try to take him. Margaret touched the brass key in her pocket. She had come to the station because her children had left her with nowhere else to stand. She had believed survival meant keeping herself warm, dry, and out of reach. But as she looked around the dim waiting room, she understood that Thomas had left her more than a locked door. He had left her a place built for arrivals. And perhaps, if she was brave enough, it could become a place where the discarded did not have to keep moving. By the end of the second week, Bellwether Station had stopped looking like a place someone had escaped into and started looking like a place people were returning to. It did not happen grandly. No ribbon was cut. No official shook Margaret's hand. The change came in small, stubborn acts. Calvin replaced the worst boards along the platform with lumber he said was too warped to sell, though Margaret noticed he measured every piece before loading it into his truck. Lillian created a ledger from an old-school notebook and wrote down every donated blanket, can of soup, tool, and dollar, because she said kindness without records could become confusion when trouble arrived. Grace scrubbed the waiting room windows until gray daylight entered without shame. Noah drew trains on scrap paper and taped them along the wall near the ticket counter. Margaret worked from morning until her body told her the truth about being 74. When her hands cramped, she sorted papers. When her knees ached, she labeled shelves. When exhaustion pressed behind her eyes, she sat at the old ticket window and made lists instead of pretending she did not need rest. That, too, was a kind of wisdom. The waiting room became the heart of the station. A folding table stood where strangers once stood in line for tickets. A coffee urn sat beside mismatched mugs. Someone donated a crock pot with only 2 settings, too hot and not hot enough. Lillian hung a handwritten notice on the wall. If you use it, clean it. If you eat it, be grateful. If you sleep here, let someone else sleep safely too. Margaret read the sign twice and said, "That sounds strict." "It sounds necessary," Lillian replied. Grace smiled for the first time without apologizing for it. The name came from Noah. He was coloring on the floor while Margaret and Calvin argued gently about what to call the place. Calvin suggested Bellwether Community Rest Stop. Lillian said that sounded like a public bathroom. Grace proposed the station house, but Margaret said there were probably a dozen of those. Noah looked up from his drawing of a red train and said, "It should be the last stop, because people come here when they don't know where else to go." No one spoke for a few seconds. Then, Margaret took the pencil from behind her ear and wrote it down. The last stop house. Calvin made the sign from a salvaged plank he had pulled out of the old freight shed. Grace painted the letters blue because it was the only paint they had enough of. Lillian insisted on adding small white trim so it would not look like a warning from the highway department. Margaret watched them work from the platform steps, Thomas's jacket around her shoulders, and felt something inside her loosen that had been tight since the day the for sale sign appeared in her yard. When the sign went up, a few cars slowed on the service road. By the next morning, more people knew. A woman from the Methodist church brought towels. The barber brought canned coffee and pretended he had not come to stare. A retired electrician named Mr. Alvarez offered to inspect the old wiring so nobody dies trying to be noble. 2 teenagers from the high school came with trash bags after their civics teacher assigned volunteer hours. Not everyone approved. Someone left a note under the platform door that read, "This is not a shelter." Someone else posted a photograph online with the caption, Old lady turns condemned station into hobo camp. Richard saw that post before Margaret did. But before it reached him, it reached a young reporter named Anna Keene. Anna worked for the Bellwether Ledger, a local paper that survived on school board meetings, obituaries, high school football, and county tax disputes. She arrived with a camera around her neck and rain boots, too clean for the service road. "I'm looking for Mrs. Whitmore," she said. Margaret was repairing a drawer behind the ticket counter. She did not stand. "Depends who's asking." "Anna Keene, Bellwether Ledger. I heard you bought the old station." "You heard right. And you're letting people stay here?" Margaret set the screwdriver down. "I'm letting people not freeze." Anna's expression changed. The rehearsed journalist face softened into something younger. "May I ask why?" Margaret looked toward the waiting room, where Grace was helping Noah button his coat, where Lillian was entering donated cans into the ledger, where Calvin was arguing with Mr. Alvarez about grounding wires near damp brick. "Because someone should have asked that question before they needed a place like this," Margaret said. Anna stayed for 2 hours. She took photographs of the sign, the restored ticket window, the old benches with folded blankets, and Noah's train drawings. She interviewed Lillian, who gave her full name and said, "My son thought getting rid of my trailer meant getting rid of responsibility. He was wrong." Grace did not give details, only said, "This was the first door I knocked on where nobody asked me to prove I deserved help." When Anna asked Margaret about her own children, Margaret did not answer directly. "This building was called useless," she said. "So was I, in more polite words. Turns out both of us still had work to do." The article came out 2 days later. 74-year-old widow turns abandoned station into safe haven. The photograph showed Margaret standing beneath the last stop house sign, not smiling exactly, but looking straight at the camera with Thomas's railroad jacket buttoned to her throat. Behind her, the old station windows glowed with afternoon light. The article spread faster than anyone expected. People shared it with comments Margaret did not know how to feel about. Some called her inspiring. Some called her reckless. Some asked why the town had let an old woman do what agencies had failed to do. A few asked whether the building was legal. That last question mattered. Lillian cut the article out and placed it in the ledger. Public attention brings casserole and trouble in equal measure. Margaret knew she was right. That afternoon, while sorting the old baggage room, Margaret found the next clue. It happened because Noah lost a toy train under a cracked wooden cabinet near the rear wall. Grace tried to reach it with a broom handle, but the cabinet shifted and revealed a narrow gap behind it. Margaret brought the flashlight. On the wall, hidden for years behind the cabinet, was a small metal plaque covered in dust. She wiped it with her sleeve. "Property, access, rail trust, maintenance, corridor. Authorized by T.W. Etienne Jobab Basherlow. Thomas, again." Below the plaque, someone had carved a small arrow pointing downward. Calvin pried up a loose floorboard near the wall. Beneath it was not open ground, but a metal hatch with a recessed handle. Lillian, standing behind them with the ledger pressed to her chest, whispered, "That is not on any public floor plan I ever saw." Margaret felt the brass key in her pocket grow heavy. Before she could answer, her phone rang. "Richard." She let it ring until it stopped. Then Elaine called. Then Peter. 3 names glowing one after another on the cracked screen. Grace looked frightened. Lillian looked angry. Calvin looked toward the platform, as if expecting cars already. Margaret turned the phone face down on the counter. "They found the article," she said. Outside, a cold wind moved along the tracks and rattled the new sign. The last stop house held firm on its hooks. But Margaret understood that from this point forward, the station was no longer hidden. And neither was she. Richard arrived the next morning, in a black SUV too clean for the service road. Elaine was with him, sitting stiffly in the passenger seat with a scarf tied carefully at her throat and a face arranged into concern. Peter came in his own car several minutes later, as if even his guilt needed separate transportation. Margaret saw them from the waiting room window. Lillian muttered, "Trouble wears good shoes." Grace gathered Noah's drawings from the table, her movements quick and frightened. Calvin, who had been tightening a loose hinge near the ticket counter, set down his screwdriver and looked at Margaret. "You want us to step out?" he asked. "No," Margaret said. "I want witnesses." Richard stepped onto the platform without looking at the sign, the repaired windows, or the swept boards beneath his feet. His eyes moved past everything that proved Margaret had not collapsed and went straight to the people inside. "Mother," he said, opening the platform door. "We need to talk." Margaret stood behind the ticket counter. It was not a throne, not a wall, not much protection at all. But it had once been a place where travelers asked for direction, and that felt appropriate. "You know where the coffee is," she said. Elaine's gaze flicked toward Lillian, Grace, Noah, and the donated blankets stacked along the bench. "Mom, this is not funny." "I wasn't joking." Richard removed his leather gloves, finger by finger. "You disappeared from your home, avoided your scheduled admission to Rose Bend, purchased a condemned structure, and now you are apparently housing strangers in an unsafe building. Do you understand how serious this is?" Margaret looked at Peter. "Good morning to you too." Peter's mouth moved. "Hi, Mom." Elaine stepped closer, lowering her voice as though tenderness could soften control. "We were terrified. You didn't answer calls. We had no idea where you were. You had enough idea to come here." "We saw the article," Richard said. "Most people did. That article makes our family look negligent." Lillian laughed once from the table. "Imagine that." Richard turned toward her. "And you are? A woman drinking coffee indoors because your mother has better manners than you." "Lillian," Margaret said mildly. "No, I'm curious," Lillian replied. "Does he always start with accusation before hello?" Elaine's face tightened. "This is exactly the problem, Mom. These people are influencing you." "These people know my name," Margaret said. "You were calling me, the situation last week." Richard placed a folder on the ticket counter. Margaret did not touch it. "An inspector will be here within the hour," he said. "There was a complaint." Calvin crossed his arms. "Anonymous, I'm sure." Richard ignored him. "This building is not permitted as a shelter. It does not meet residential code. It has no proper heat, no certified electrical system, no occupancy approval, and no liability coverage." Margaret looked around at the old station. The imperfect boards, the borrowed table, the blankets, the coffee urn, the child's drawings, the people who had slept under a roof because she had refused to close the door. "You sound very informed for a concerned son." "I spoke to the town office." "When?" Richard's silence answered. Elaine clasped her purse in both hands. "Mom, please, we don't want this to become ugly." Margaret looked at her daughter. "Then why did you bring Ugly with you?" Peter stared at the floor. Outside, another vehicle came down the service road. A white town pickup stopped beside Richard's SUV. A woman in a navy coat stepped out carrying a clipboard. She was in her 50s, with short dark hair, practical boots, and the tired expression of someone who had spent years being blamed for rules she had not written. "Mrs. Whitmore?" she called. Margaret opened the door before Richard could. "I'm Margaret. Clara Henson, town building inspector." Richard moved beside her too quickly. "Thank you for coming." Clara gave him a brief glance. "I know who called. Mr. Whitmore." Richard's jaw shifted. Margaret liked Clara a little for that. The inspection took nearly an hour. Clara checked the platform boards, the boarded windows, the camping stove, the old wiring, the water source, the exits, the lower stairwell, and the room where Grace and Noah had slept. She was not cruel. That almost made it worse. Cruel people could be dismissed. Fair people with bad news had to be heard. "This is not approved for occupancy," Clara said at last. Grace's hand tightened around Noah's shoulder. Margaret nodded. "What has to change?" Richard stepped in. "Mother, that's not the question. The question is whether you should be here at all." "No," Clara said, still looking at Margaret. "That is not my question. My question is whether the building can be made safe." Margaret felt the room breathe. Calvin asked, "Can it?" Clara tapped her pen against the clipboard. "Structurally, the main waiting room is better than I expected. Platform needs work. Electrical must be inspected by a licensed contractor. No open flame heating. Fire extinguishers, smoke detectors, clear exits, sanitation plan, temporary occupancy application, and no more overnight stays until minimum requirements are met." Grace's face fell. Lillian stood. "Where exactly do you suggest people sleep tonight?" Clara's expression changed, but the clipboard stayed firm. "I don't have authority to solve that." "That's convenient," Lillian said. "It's also true." Margaret raised a hand before the argument sharpened. "How long do I have?" Clara looked at Richard, then back at Margaret. Normally, I would issue an immediate closure order. Richard relaxed. But, Clara continued, because the article created public attention, because improvements have already begun, and because I see no evidence of commercial operation, I can issue a 72-hour corrective notice before escalation. Richard's face hardened. 72 hours is reckless. So, is leaving people with nowhere to go, Clara said. My notice is not permission, it is a deadline. Margaret accepted the paper. 72 hours. 3 days to do what younger people with money, trucks, contractors, and city grants had not done in years. Elaine moved closer. Mom, come home with us, please. We can talk about all this somewhere safe. Which home? Margaret asked. The one you sold? Elaine flushed. Richard has space. Richard said, temporarily. The word was so familiar, Margaret almost smiled. Temporary had been the assisted living room. Temporary had been the loss of her kitchen. Temporary had been every decision they wanted her to accept permanently. No, she said. Richard leaned forward. Then I will petition the court. Peter finally looked up. Rich? No, Richard snapped. Enough. She is endangering herself and others. She is being encouraged by strangers. She is misusing family resources. Margaret's voice cut through his. Family resources? He realized the mistake too late. My house sold, she said. My belongings were boxed. My care account was being arranged without my consent. And now, a $9 station I bought with my own money is also a family resource? Elaine whispered. That is not what he meant. It is exactly what he meant. Noah, frightened by the raised voices, began to cry softly. Grace lifted him. Margaret saw Richard glance at the child as though he were evidence, not a boy. That decided something in her. She walked to the baggage room wall and stood beside the loose floorboard Calvin had not yet replaced. The plaque remained visible, its letters cleaned enough to read. Property access. Rail Trust. Maintenance corridor. Authorized by T.W. Etienne Jobai Bachelot. Richard saw it. For the first time since he had arrived, his confidence faltered. What is that? He asked. I don't know yet. He stepped closer. Calvin moved into his path. Careful. Floors open. Richard looked past him at the hatch. This area wasn't in the auction listing. No, Margaret said. It wasn't. Elaine came to the doorway, pale now. Mom, what does TW mean? Margaret touched the brass key through her coat pocket. Thomas Whitmore. Peter's eyes widened. Richard recovered quickly, too quickly. Then this may complicate ownership. You should not touch anything further without legal guidance. For once, Margaret said, we agree. She turned to Clara. If I file for temporary compliance and request the old Rail Trust records, will your office receive them? Clara looked from the plaque to the hatch, then to Richard. If they exist, yes. They exist, Lillian said from behind the table. Paper has a longer memory than families. Richard's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, and Margaret saw the name before he turned it away. Darrow Development. Not a lawyer. Not a doctor. Not Rosebend. A developer. The room seemed to narrow around that small betrayal. Margaret did not accuse him, not yet. Some truths were stronger when left to ripen in front of witnesses. Clara handed Margaret a copy of the notice. 72 hours, Mrs. Whitmore. After that, I have to act. Margaret folded the paper carefully and placed it in Lillian's ledger. Richard watched the ledger as if noticing for the first time that Margaret was not alone, not confused, and not undocumented. When her children left, Elaine paused at the platform door. Mom, she said, softer now, you're making this harder than it has to be. Margaret looked at her daughter, and for a moment she saw the little girl who once collected stones beside the tracks. No, Elaine, she said. I'm making it harder to take. The SUV doors closed outside. Dust rose behind their tires as they drove away. Inside the station, no one spoke until the service road went quiet. Then Calvin picked up his screwdriver. 72 hours, he said. Lillian opened the ledger to a fresh page. Grace wiped Noah's face. Margaret took out the brass key, looked toward the hatch, and felt the old building waiting beneath her feet. Then we'd better find out what Thomas left us, she said. The first 24 hours after Clara Henson's notice passed in a blur of lists, phone calls, and people arriving with urgency. Calvin found a licensed electrician willing to inspect the station after supper. Mr. Alvarez checked every temporary cord. Lillian sat at the folding table with her ledger, turning donated cash into columns, receipts, and proof. Grace took Noah to the church basement for the night, but she returned every morning with coffee, clean towels, refusing to collapse. Margaret did not sleep much. The deadline was not only about repairs. Richard had made that clear. If the station failed inspection, he would use it as evidence that she was unstable, reckless, and unfit to manage herself. He would turn the building into a symptom. He would turn her kindness into a diagnosis. On the second evening, the weather changed. Clouds rolled over Bellwether in heavy layers, and the wind came hard out of the west, rattling the new sign until Calvin climbed a ladder and added 2 more bolts. The local radio warned of severe rain, flooded roads, and outages. "Of course," Lillian said, taping receipts into the ledger. "Truth never arrives on a sunny day." By 9 o'clock, rain hammered the roof. Water came through 3 places Margaret had thought were patched. The platform door bucked against its new latch. Somewhere below the floor, metal groaned. Then, the battery lantern flickered, and the waiting room dropped into black. Grace gasped. Noah started crying. "It's all right," Margaret called. "No one move fast." Calvin clicked on his flashlight. Mr. Alvarez cursed softly near the service closet. The breaker they had tested that afternoon had tripped. But when Alvarez checked the panel, he frowned. "Main temporary line is fine," he said. "Something old is drawing from below." Margaret already knew. The hatch. They moved the cabinet, lifted the loose floorboard, and exposed the metal handle. The brass key was warm from Margaret's pocket when she slid it into the hatch lock. This time, it turned. The hatch opened with a wet sigh. A ladder descended into darkness. "No," Calvin said immediately. "You are not going down there first." Margaret looked at him. "I am the only one who knows what Thomas's markings mean. You're also the one everybody here needs alive." That stopped her, because it was true. Calvin descended first with the flashlight between his teeth. Margaret followed slowly, 1 rung at a time. Below them was not a basement, but a narrow brick corridor running beneath the baggage room. Old conduit lined the wall. Dust lay thick except in one place where water had seeped through. At the end of the corridor stood the steel door from the lower passage, the same auxiliary electrical room Margaret had found days before. From this side, it opened with a simple latch. Inside was a cramped room with dead panels, old ceramic insulators, a workbench, and shelves full of maintenance tags. On the back wall, beneath a sheet of canvas, stiff with age, sat a gray metal box. Margaret knew before she touched it. Thomas had not hidden treasure the way greedy people imagine treasure. He had hidden paper. The box contained a leather map tube, 3 sealed envelopes, deed copies tied with cotton string, and a letter addressed in Thomas's handwriting. For Margaret, if they tried to make you small. She had to sit before she opened it. Calvin turned the flashlight toward the floor, giving her what privacy he could. Thomas's letter was not long. He wrote that the Bellwether station land was more complicated than the county records suggested. Part of the platform and the lower maintenance corridor had been transferred into the Bellwether Rail Trust in 1986, after the railroad abandoned passenger service. The trust had one purpose. If the station ever stopped operating as transportation property, the remaining structure and easement were to be preserved for public benefit, especially shelter, emergency aid, and elder support. Margaret pressed her hand over her mouth. Thomas had discovered the trust while reviewing old transfer maps. He had filed corrected diagrams, copies of the conditional deed, and a preservation request. But before the county acted, leadership changed, records were boxed, and the matter disappeared into storage. He kept copies because he did not trust silence. The final envelope held something newer. A letter from Darrow Development, dated 8 months earlier, offered to purchase all adjacent station-related parcels, easements, and disputed access rights from any family party able to assist in clearing objections. Attached was an email printout between Richard Whitmore and Darrow's acquisition manager. Margaret read only a few lines before her chest went cold. "If my mother is declared unable to manage property decisions, I can help consolidate the issue quickly." There was also a note from the lawyer who had prepared the sale documents for Maple Ridge Lane. He had written that Margaret should not be informed of unresolved rail trust questions until after the family secured control of her assets. For several seconds, the storm was the only voice in the room. Calvin said a word Margaret had never heard him use in front of women. She folded the papers carefully. Her hands shook now, but not from weakness. Anger, when it had somewhere truthful to stand, could become very steady. They carried the box upstairs. By morning, the service road had flooded in 2 low places, but Clara Henson arrived anyway in rubber boots, followed by Samuel Ortiz from County Records, Anna Keene with her camera, Richard, Elaine, Peter, and Darrow's counsel in an expensive raincoat. Richard looked tired and furious. "Mother," he said, "whatever you think you found, you need to let professionals handle it." Margaret placed Thomas's metal box on the folding table. "This professional?" she asked, setting down the lawyer's note. "Or this one?" She placed the Darrow email beside it. Peter stepped forward first. "What is that?" "Ask your brother." Richard's face drained, then hardened. "Those are out of context." Samuel Ortiz examined the deed copies. Clara read the trust language twice. Anna did not take pictures yet. She waited until the truth had finished landing. Darrow's counsel reached for one document. Lillian slapped his hand with the ledger. "Copies," she said. "You may request copies." Clara looked at Richard. "Mr. Whitmore, did you file the complaint about unsafe occupancy?" "I was concerned." "Were you also in communication with Darrow Development about clearing access rights?" "That has nothing to do with my mother sleeping in a condemned building." Margaret lifted the trust document. "This building was never only condemned, it was buried." Samuel's voice was quiet but firm. "These copies correspond to index numbers in the old rail storage system. I can verify them today. If valid, the auction transferred only the county's disposable interest. It did not extinguish the trust obligations." "What does that mean?" Elaine whispered. "It means," Clara said, "your mother may be the lawful steward of a property the town should never have treated as ordinary surplus." Richard stared at the table. For once, he had no prepared sentence. Margaret looked at him and saw not a monster, but something sadder, a son who had learned to call greed practicality because it sounded cleaner. "You sold my house," she said. "You tried to sell my judgment. And when I found a door you did not know existed, you called it danger." Elaine began to cry, but Margaret did not soften yet. Peter picked up Thomas's letter with trembling hands. He read the first line and covered his face. Outside, the rain thinned. A pale strip of light appeared beyond the tracks. Clara removed the closure notice from her clipboard and wrote across it in block letters, "Temporary compliance, review extended pending, trust verification." "The station still needs work," she said to Margaret. "A lot of it." Margaret nodded. "So do most things worth saving." Anna finally lifted her camera, but the photograph she took was not of Richard's shame. It was of Margaret's hand resting on Thomas's metal box, the brass key beside it, Lillian's ledger open, and the first clean light of morning reaching across the old ticket counter. No one cheered. That would have made it smaller. Instead, people went to work. Calvin checked the platform door. Lillian copied document numbers. Grace made Noah breakfast from donated oatmeal. Samuel called the county archive. Clara measured exits again. And Margaret stood for one quiet moment at the window, watching rainwater run along the old tracks toward a place she could not see. Thomas had not saved her by leaving her money. He had saved her by trusting she would know what to do with the truth. The truth did not fix everything by sunset. That was the first lesson Margaret learned after Thomas's metal box came into the light. Richard did not drop to his knees. Elaine did not suddenly understand every wound she had helped make. Peter did not become brave in a single morning. The county did not wave a wand over broken wiring, cracked boards, and water stains. The station was still cold in places, still damaged, still complicated, but the direction of power had changed. Within 2 weeks, Samuel Ortiz verified the rail trust documents through the county archive. Clara Henson placed the Last Stop House under a temporary restoration and public benefit review instead of a closure order. Anna Keene's follow-up article was less sentimental and more dangerous. It printed dates, document numbers, and the phrase, "unresolved trust obligations." Darrow Development withdrew its interest before anyone from the company agreed to an interview. The lawyer who had prepared Margaret's house sale documents suddenly became difficult to reach. Richard called 3 times before Margaret answered. When she finally did, he said, "Mother, I think we should talk privately." Margaret stood at the ticket counter, looking at the new smoke detector Calvin had installed above the door. "We already did private. Private is where you made decisions about me." There was a pause. "I made mistakes," Richard said. "No," Margaret replied. "You made plans. Mistakes are when you forget milk at the store. Plans have folders, phone calls, and developers." He said nothing. She did not hang up. That was not forgiveness. It was discipline. "If you want to speak to me," she said, "you can come here on Saturday at 10. Calvin will be present. Lillian will take notes. And you will not raise your voice in this building. This building is between family now." "No, Richard, this building is why I still have boundaries." On Saturday, Richard came. He looked smaller without certainty. Not humble exactly, but less polished. He brought no folder, which Margaret considered a beginning. Elaine came too, carrying a covered dish with both hands as if food could apologize before she did. Peter arrived early and did not sit. He went straight to Calvin and asked where help was needed. Calvin handed him a box of screws, platform rail. Peter nodded, took off his coat, and went outside. Margaret watched through the window as her youngest son knelt beside a warped board in the cold. He did not look back to see if she noticed. That made it matter more. Inside, Elaine cried. "I thought we were helping," she said. Margaret sat across from her at the folding table. "Sometimes people use helping as a way to avoid listening." Elaine wiped her face. "I was scared you'd fall, scared you'd get sick, scared everything would become my responsibility." "I was scared too," Margaret said. "The difference is you tried to solve your fear by taking away my choices." Elaine bowed her head. Margaret did not reach across the table. Not yet. Love did not require pretending the wound was clean. Richard's apology was harder. He admitted the Darrow contact only after Lillian placed the printed email between them. He said he had thought the station land might help pay for Margaret's care. He said he had been under pressure. He said the lawyer had made it seem simple. Each sentence tried to dress greed in work clothes. Margaret listened until he ran out of coverings. Then she said, "You wanted me declared incapable because I stood between you and something you wanted." Richard's face tightened, then broke in a way Margaret had not expected. "I didn't think of it like that. That is not an excuse, it is the problem." He nodded once. For the first time, he did not argue. The consequences came slowly, as real consequences do. The house sale was reviewed. The care account was frozen, pending inquiry. Richard resigned from a local board after Anna's article raised questions. The lawyer faced investigation. None of it gave Margaret back Maple Ridge Lane. The pear tree, the laundry wall, the blue porch rail, those belonged now to memory and paperwork. She grieved that privately. Some mornings, loss still arrived before coffee. But each day, the last stop house asked something of her hands, and work kept grief from becoming a locked room. By spring, the station had heat in the main waiting room, inspected wiring, fire extinguishers, a working restroom, and a temporary occupancy certificate framed beside Lillian's rules. The baggage room became a women's sleeping room with donated cots and curtains Grace sewed from old bedsheets. The ticket office became Margaret's small office, though she still called it the counter. The lower corridor was cleaned, reinforced, and documented, not hidden anymore. A brass plaque was mounted beside the door. Thomas Whitmore Memorial Room. For those who kept the line open. Peter made the frame himself. He did not ask Margaret if that made things right. He seemed to understand that right was not a single act. It was repetition. It was showing up when nobody praised you for it. He came every Saturday. Sometimes they spoke. Sometimes they only worked. Elaine began volunteering once a month, first in stiff silence, later with more usefulness than tears. Richard stayed away for a long time. Margaret did not chase him. The door was open to accountability, not control. That distinction became one of the rules of the house. The last stop house was placed into a new community trust before Margaret's 75th birthday. Not in Richard's name, not in Elaine's, not even in Peter's. The board included Clara, Samuel, Lillian, Calvin, Grace, and 2 rotating community members. Margaret signed the documents with Thomas's brass key lying on the table beside her pen. She did not build the place, so anyone could inherit power over it. She built it so no one could easily close the door again. On the first anniversary of the day she bought Bellwether Station for $9. The platform was full. There were no speeches long enough to ruin the moment. Calvin grilled hot dogs under a borrowed canopy. Lillian guarded the donation jar like a bank vault. Grace laughed as Noah ran along the platform with a paper conductor's hat. Clara stood near the exit sign, pretending she was not proud of how well it had been installed. Samuel brought copies of the verified trust records in a blue binder and presented them to Margaret as if they were a medal. Peter arrived carrying a small wooden bench he had made from salvaged platform boards. On the back, he had carved, "For Maggie and Thomas." The last stop was never the end. Margaret touched the letters with 2 fingers. For a while, she could not speak. Near sunset, after most people had eaten, talked, and gone inside for coffee, Margaret sat on that bench facing the tracks. Wild flowers had begun growing beyond the gravel where the old spur curved toward the fields. The rails were rusted, but in the evening light, they still shone in thin lines. Elaine came out and sat beside her, leaving space between them. "Do you think someday you'll forgive us?" she asked. Margaret looked at the open station door, at Grace folding blankets, at Lillian correcting Noah's spelling on a sign, at Peter tightening one more screw on a rail that did not need tightening. "I think someday is built one day at a time," she said. Elaine nodded, crying quietly, but she did not ask for more than that. A knock sounded at the platform entrance. A man stood there with a duffel bag in one hand and a hospital bracelet still around his wrist. He looked embarrassed to be alive and unsure where to put himself. Margaret rose slowly. The station behind her glowed warm through restored windows. The old sign moved slightly in the evening wind, but it held. She walked to the door, Thomas's brass key resting in her pocket, not as a secret now, but as a reminder. "Ma'am," the man said, "someone told me this was the last stop." Margaret opened the door wider. "There's always room for one more at the last stop," she said. And behind her, in the building everyone had called worthless, the lights stayed on.